In this video, we'll cover the UCC's gap filler provision relating to the quantity of goods, section 306, subsection 1 of Article 2. On the one hand, quantity would seem to be a term that would be the least susceptible to being supplied by a statutory gap filler provision. How many goods are to be sold would seem to be so central to a particular transaction that if the parties have not agreed on a quantity, then there's probably no intent to be bound yet. Stated differently, the absence of an agreement on something as significant, as central as quantity of goods involved suggests that the parties are still in the process of negotiating, in the process of clarifying their intentions as to what the deal would be. And generally that is correct. As a general matter, parties need to have an agreement as to quantity to form a contract for the sale of goods. The UCC will not supply a quantity term to fill in a gap in the parties' agreement. Stated differently, if there is no agreement on quantity, there is no contract between the parties. Note, we saw a similar rule in the context of the statute of frauds. A sale of goods over $500 needs to be evidenced by sufficient writing that indicates a quantity for the contract to be enforceable. If the writing fails to indicate a quantity of goods, the writing fails to satisfy the requirements of the statute of frauds. Still, 306 subsection 1 of Article 2 does provide a type of gap filler concerning quantity, but it is a different kind of gap filler. The provision does not supply quantity if the parties have failed to agree on a quantity. Ultimately, the parties must have some agreement on the quantity of goods in order to form a contract for sale. But under 306 subsection 1, there is a gap filler to interpret the quantity term that the parties have agreed upon. 306 subsection 1 applies in two situations involving output contracts and requirement contracts. Output contracts are contracts in which the quantity of goods to be sold is based upon the output of the seller. The contract does not specify or state a specific quantity. Instead, the contract says that the buyer will purchase all or a percentage of the seller's entire output of a particular good. For example, imagine a phone maker needs to buy batteries as a component that goes into its phone. A small battery manufacturer can make approximately 100,000 batteries per month, so the parties agree that the phone maker will purchase all of the batteries that the manufacturer makes each month, all of the seller's output. Or maybe the parties agree that the phone maker will just buy half of the batteries that the manufacturer makes each month, 50% of the seller's output. Output contracts present a specific kind of business risk for the buyer, in this case the phone maker. The seller has control and therefore discretion in how much goods to produce. The seller's output of goods might change. For example, what if the manufacturer decides to improve efficiency in its factory and now produces 3 times as many batteries per month? Now the phone maker might have to purchase more batteries than it needs. Or what if the manufacturer decides batteries are unprofitable and stops making batteries altogether, or reduces its battery production capacity to focus on more profitable products? Now the phone maker has too few batteries and must find other sources. It's these kinds of scenarios where the quantity gap filler in subsection 1 of 306 comes into play. The other situation where 306 subsection 1 comes into play is in requirement contracts. Requirement contracts are like the opposite of an output contract. In a requirement contract, the contract says that the seller will provide and sell to the buyer all or a percentage of the buyer's requirements for a particular good. So back to our example, the phone maker might need approximately 1 million batteries per month, and the parties agree that the phone maker will buy all of its monthly requirements of batteries from the battery manufacturer. Requirement contracts present the opposite kind of business risk, a risk that faces the seller, the battery manufacturer in our example. The phone maker here has control and therefore discretion in how much of the goods to demand. The phone maker's requirements for the goods might change. For example, the phone maker's requirements for batteries might increase due to the increased demand for its popular phone beyond what the battery manufacturer can produce. Or the phone maker's requirements might decrease because its phone becomes obsolete. In this case, the battery manufacturer may have extra batteries on hand and no buyer to sell them to. In either case, for both output contracts and requirement contracts, by definition, the contract does not specify a quantity of goods. Instead, the contract gives one party discretion as to the quantity of goods to be sold. In the absence of an agreement to the contrary, subsection 1 of 306 fills in a gap by restraining the party's discretion in both output and requirement contracts to protect against the business risk that we just noted. It does so by imposing two limits on the discretion of sellers in output contracts and buyers in requirement contracts. The first limit is the requirement of good faith. The quantity of the seller's output or the buyer's requirement must be in good faith. In an output contract, the seller's actual output must be whatever amount the seller would produce in good faith. And in a requirements contract, the buyer's actual requirements is whatever amount the buyer would require in good faith. Recall, good faith includes two components: a subjective component that requires honesty, prohibiting a party to act opportunistically or with an illegitimate motive, and an objective component that requires commercial reasonableness, that prohibits a party from anything that would frustrate the reasonable or justified expectations of the other party. The second limitation that 306 subsection 1 places in this context is that a quantity produced by the seller or required by the buyer cannot be unreasonably disproportionate to any stated estimate set forth in the parties' agreement, or, if there is no stated estimate, any normal prior outputs or requirements. Note that the seller's output or the buyer's requirement may still be disproportionate or different than any stated estimate or prior output or requirement. But what is required to breach this gap filler, what is prohibited by this gap filler, is that the seller's output or the buyer's requirement is unreasonably disproportionate. Like the objective component of good faith, this limitation on discretion protects the reasonable expectations of the buyer in an output contract or seller in a requirement contract, which highlights an important point to keep in mind, that the limitations imposed by good faith and proportionality can overlap. For example, in a requirements contract, a quantity a buyer demands from the seller may be made in bad faith but also be unreasonably disproportionate to the buyer's prior requirements. So it is possible to breach both the limits on discretion imposed by the gap filler term under subsection 1 of 306, but the two limitations have independent import. Each applies independently of the other. For example, in a requirements contract, the quantity a buyer demands from the seller may be unreasonably disproportionate to its prior requirements and thus breach 306 subsection 1, even though the quantity the buyer demanded was made in good faith. Likewise, a quantity a buyer demands from the seller may be made in bad faith and thus breach subsection 1 of 306, even though the quantity the buyer demanded was not unreasonably disproportionate to buyer's prior normal requirements. Thus, good faith and proportionality impose separate and distinct limitations on the discretion that may be exercised in the context of output and requirements contracts. So in this video, we covered the concepts of output and requirement contracts, and noted that because these types of contracts do not specify a quantity of goods involved, they give one party the discretion to make that determination. Unless that discretion is somehow limited, unless the parties agree to somehow limit the discretion of the seller in an output contract, or the buyer in a requirement contracts, it puts the other party in a position of vulnerability. To address that vulnerability, we saw how the gap filler provision of Article 2, Section 306, subsection 1, limits the discretion of a seller in an output contract and a buyer in a requirement contract. In the next video, we'll cover another consequential UCC gap filler provision concerning the price to be paid for the goods.